The sound of drums fades under the heavy silence of grief. Friends and family of Alino Faso, a 44-year-old patriot from Burkina Faso, lean over his flag-draped coffin as it returns from the Ivory Coast. His mother's trembling hands trace the red, green, and gold stripes, whispering the last prayer of a mother who knows her son didn't die by accident. For 6 long months, Alino had vanished behind foreign bars, accused of espionage, cut off from the world he inspired. When his body finally reappeared lifeless and scarred, the officials called it suicide. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was sacrifice. That night, something changed. The air in Ouagadougou thickened with anger and disbelief. Thousands poured into the streets holding candles and flags, shouting one name, Alino Faso, not as a victim, but as a martyr. Posters read, "You silenced a voice, not the people." And when the nation looked to its leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, he did not send condolences. He sent 3,000 soldiers south. No diplomatic notes, no hesitation, just the roar of engines cutting through the Burkina countryside, drawing a line no one would cross again. To the outside world, it looked like defiance. To Burkina Faso, it felt like dignity, finally standing up for itself. Because every generation reaches a moment when silence becomes surrender. And for Traoré's Burkina Faso, that moment was Alino Faso's death. So here's the question that now echoes across Africa. How many African voices must be killed before the continent finally answers back? Stay with us as we uncover why one man's death could awaken a nation, and perhaps an entire continent. If you believe Africa deserves to speak without fear, share this story. If you believe truth matters more than headlines, subscribe, because this is the Africa the world was never meant to see. It began with the sound of engines, not speeches. Before dawn, a convoy of armored trucks rolled out from Ouagadougou toward the southern border. Inside each vehicle sat men in fatigues, young, silent, focused, carrying not only weapons, but the weight of a nation's outrage. 3,000 modern soldiers personally ordered by Captain Ibrahim Traoré were heading south. Officially, it was a defensive mobilization. But everyone in Burkina Faso knew what it really was, a statement of justice written in steel. The trigger was not politics. It was Alino Faso. For years, he had been a voice for the forgotten, a digital preacher of Pan-African dignity. On his small smartphone camera, he spoke from the dusty streets of Bobo Dioulasso, telling young people to believe in themselves, to reject the begging bowl politics that kept their countries on their knees. His words were raw, unpolished, but powerful. He didn't quote Western economists or politicians. He spoke the language of pain and pride that every African heart could understand. And then in January 2025, Alino was gone, arrested in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, accused of espionage and conspiracy. His followers called it a kidnapping. His family called it silencing. For 6 months, there was nothing, no images, no court hearings, no proof of life. Then one humid afternoon in late July, news broke Alino was dead. Cause of death, suicide by hanging. No photographs, no witnesses, no autopsy report, just an official statement meant to close the book. But this time, the story didn't end there. Burkina Faso refused to stay quiet. Within hours, Ouagadougou erupted. Crowds flooded the streets carrying portraits of Alino chanting, "He died for Africa." Women wept openly, students painted murals, soldiers saluted his photo in silence. For the people, Alino's death wasn't just personal tragedy. It was the murder of an idea that an African can speak freely without dying for it. At the Ivorian embassy, protests turned into vigils. Posters read, "You killed one voice, not the revolution." To the world, it looked like unrest. To Burkina Faso, it was mourning with purpose. The pain was collective, but the message was singular: never again. When President Traoré finally spoke, his voice carried no anger, only resolve. They can kill the body of a Burkina, but they will never kill the soul of our independence. Those weren't empty words, they were marching orders. By early October 2025, satellite images confirmed military convoys moving toward Banfora Sindhu and Nyangoloko strategic gateways to the Ivorian frontier. The operation was named Southern Shield, a phrase that sounded defensive but meant something much deeper. You will not touch our dignity again. Inside the barracks, soldiers painted Alino's initials AF on their helmets. Some played his old videos before deployment, listening to his words like prayers. "We're not fighting for revenge," one soldier said, "we're fighting for respect." To outsiders, it seemed reckless, but to the Burkina it was long overdue. For decades, they had watched their borders violated, their resources extracted, their sovereignty dismissed. Now, under Traore, even grief had become an act of independence. And yet behind the defiance lay something profoundly human. Alino's mother, speaking during his funeral, whispered, "He spoke for the children of Africa. Now the children of Africa will protect him." Her words spread across social media faster than any government statement. It wasn't just the army mobilizing, it was a generation awakening. The streets, once filled with tears, now echoed with drums. Markets reopened with flags above every stall. Pain had turned into pride. A death had become a doctrine. And Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old soldier who once spoke of a second liberation, was now living it. Because when he sent those 3,000 men to the border, he wasn't preparing for war. He was announcing a new rule for Africa. Sovereignty is not negotiable. The morning after the deployment, the silence of Ouagadougou was broken by applause. Not the sound of celebration, but of defiance. Citizens stood along the main roads as military convoys thundered past, saluting every soldier as if they were escorting the very spirit of Alino Faso. The air smelled of dust and diesel. The sound of engines became a hymn of pride. For once, the people of Burkina Faso weren't waiting for someone else to defend them. They were witnessing their government finally act. Across the country, radio stations replayed Alino's last recorded words, "If we don't defend our dignity, someone else will bury it for us." Those words had once been a warning, now they felt like prophecy fulfilled. In every province, volunteers formed neighborhood defense brigades bringing water and food to the troops stationed in the south. Artists painted murals of Alino, wearing a crown of thorns made of barbed wire, a martyr for modern Africa. Students wrote messages on banners, "The South is not for sale." A sense of unity swept through the streets, the kind that history rarely gives a nation twice. But not everyone applauded. From Paris, diplomats called the move reckless. From Washington, analysts labeled it provocative. And in Abidjan, President Alassane Ouattara's government condemned Burkina Faso's unjustified aggression, insisting that Alino Faso's death had been properly investigated. They urged restraint and dialogue through established channels. To the Burkinabe public, those words sounded hollow, another sermon on peace from those who never lived without fear. Still, the world was watching, and Traoré knew it. His decision to deploy troops wasn't just military, it was moral theater. Each tank that crossed Banfora carried two messages: deterrence and dignity. He wanted the world to see that Burkina Faso would no longer beg for justice, it would enforce it. Inside the presidential compound, aides described a leader calm, deliberate, unmoved by threats of sanctions. "If they call us dangerous for defending our citizens," he reportedly told his cabinet, "then let danger have a Burkinabe name." Meanwhile, in Abidjan, panic met denial. Ivory Coast intelligence had not expected a reaction so swift or disciplined. The images of 3,000 Burkinabe soldiers fortifying positions near the frontier unsettled not only Ouattara's administration, but every Western ally watching from afar. Operation Southern Shield was never meant to be symbolic. It was a doctrine made visible. Regional blocs like ECOWAS issued cautious statements calling for calm. Yet their language betrayed bias. Peace must prevail. One communique read the same phrase often used to justify silence when African citizens are killed abroad. In Mali and Niger, however, the reaction was the opposite. State TV anchors praised Traoré's decisiveness, calling him the defender of African dignity. Crowds gathered in Bamako and Niamey, waving ass flags, chanting, "Burkina is not alone." The divide was no longer diplomatic, it was civilizational. Two Africas had emerged, one that still sought permission from old masters and one that chose to stand on its own, even if it stood alone. Inside, Burkina Faso morale surged. Soldiers at the front recorded messages for their families, saying, "We are not at war. We are guarding memory." Across the Sahel, social media erupted with the hashtag #WeAreAlino, uniting voices from Senegal to Tanzania. It was no longer about borders, it was about belonging. Western commentators mocked Traoré's youthful nationalism, but they missed the point. For millions of Africans watching, this wasn't about aggression, it was about awakening. They saw in Burkina Faso the reflection of their own suppressed pride, the courage they had long been told to hide. And as dusk fell over the southern plains, the soldiers of Operation Southern Shield stood watch not just for threats but for meaning. Beneath their boots lay the soil of a country that had chosen self-respect over silence. It was the climax of grief turned into power, of tragedy reborn as principle. And as the red sun sank behind the Sahel horizon, one truth echoed across Africa: they killed a man but gave birth to a movement. When the gun stayed silent and the borders held, something remarkable began to unfold inside Burkina Faso. The country once defined by poverty and conflict was now defined by purpose. For the first time in decades, citizens weren't waiting for aid shipments or speeches from foreign envoys, they were organizing themselves. In the weeks following Alino Faso's funeral, communities from Bobo-Dioulasso to Ouagadougou began what they called the People's Vigil. Volunteers stood guard at night, not against enemies but against fear itself. Women gathered in markets to collect food for the station troops. Students used their classrooms as meeting halls to discuss sovereignty, history, and dignity. Something deeper than patriotism had taken root, a collective memory reborn. And at the heart of it all was the same phrase that had echoed during the protests: "The South is not for sale." Those words, painted on banners and buses, became more than a slogan. They became the new moral contract between people and government, a silent promise that Burkina Faso would never again trade dignity for diplomacy. Across the civil service, a quiet revolution began. Bureaucrats who once looked to Paris for approval now looked to Ouagadougou for direction. State institutions were instructed to review all bilateral agreements with Western partners, particularly those related to mining data and security. Every clause, every signature, every foreign partnership that undermined sovereignty was brought into question. Inside Parliament, debates turned fiery. Some lawmakers warned that Traore's boldness might isolate the country. Others countered that isolation was better than humiliation. One young member stood up and declared, "If independence costs us comfort, then comfort was never ours to begin with." The chamber erupted in applause. Meanwhile, the emotional landscape of the nation was transforming. Families hung portraits of Alino Faso in their living rooms next to national heroes like Thomas Sankara. Radio programs dedicated to his memory filled the airwaves with discussions about economic independence, African identity, and digital freedom. Teachers used his story to teach children the meaning of courage, not as rebellion, but as responsibility. But the ripple went beyond borders. The confrontation between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast exposed a deeper fault line across the region, a philosophical divide between those who govern for survival and those who lead for sovereignty. The AIS alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, tightened its coordination. Joint statements were issued denouncing colonial interference disguised as cooperation. Together, they announced new initiatives for collective defense, shared mining resources, and digital sovereignty. In contrast, Abidjan, Accra, and Dakar doubled down on their ties with the European Union and the IMF, presenting themselves as pillars of stability. But for many Africans, watching stability without dignity began to look more like submission. Inside Burkina Faso, young people now spoke openly of the Alino generation. A generation born not from privilege, but from pain, and determined to turn loss into law. NGOs, once the dominant presence in local development, now faced stricter oversight. The government introduced the National Sovereignty Charter, ensuring that no foreign-funded project could operate without public accountability. The transformation wasn't about isolationism, it was about self-definition. The once fractured nation now breathed with a shared rhythm, that of unity forged through sacrifice. The pain of Alino's death had not divided Burkina Faso, it had rebuilt it. And yet beneath the unity lay a quiet tension. Everyone knew this new path came with risks, sanctions, pressure, even war. But when asked if they were afraid, an old vendor near Ouagadougou's central market smiled and said, "We were born afraid. Now we are simply awake." In that single sentence lay the truth of a nation reborn not by force but by faith in itself. A people once dependent had become a people determined. In Washington, the story of Burkina Faso's defiance reached the headlines with a single phrase: "A young leader plays with fire." Television panels debated whether Captain Ibrahim Traoré was reckless or revolutionary, while policy think tanks rushed to brief Congress on rising instability in the Sahel. The same phrases that had been used to describe every African nation that ever tried to stand on its own: instability, unpredictability, threat to regional order, were being recycled again. But beneath the political language was something far more revealing: fear. Not fear of war, but fear of example. Because if one small landlocked nation could resist pressure and still survive, others might follow. The State Department released a statement calling for dialogue and de-escalation, urging all sides to respect the rule of law. Yet to many observers in Africa, that sounded ironic, coming from the same governments that have armed coups, financed mercenaries, and written the very rules they now preach. Across the Atlantic, Paris reacted with its usual unease. French analysts on BFM TV lamented the loss of influence in Francophone Africa, warning that anti-French sentiment is spreading faster than counter-terrorism success. For decades, France's presence in the Sahel had been justified as humanitarian, but Alino Faso's death and Traoré's response shattered that illusion. The African public now asked a simple question: if France brought peace, why are we still burying our children? At the United Nations, diplomats whispered about a Sahel realignment. The new ES alliance Burkina Faso Mali Niger had already expelled French troops, canceled unfair mining contracts, and invited cooperation with Russia, China, and even Turkey. Western envoys warned of a shift toward authoritarian partners. But for Traoré's supporters, it was not about East or West, it was about self. Meanwhile, global media outlets struggled to frame the story. Some called Traoré Africa's last revolutionary, others branded him a populist soldier in over his head. Yet none could ignore the symbolism: a country that refused to kneel. The images of Burkinabe troops standing along the southern border were broadcast across the continent, not as a threat, but as a statement. We have learned to defend ourselves. In Europe, the reaction was mixed. Young activists in Paris and Brussels shared clips of Alino Faso's speeches, comparing his words to Martin Luther King Jr. and Thomas Sankara. But European politicians feared something else: that Traoré's movement would erode Western leverage in Africa's resource markets. Gold, uranium, and data, all strategic assets now guarded by governments that no longer trust old contracts. And in the United States, the conversation grew quieter but more divided. Some lawmakers argued that Washington should re-engage before Russia fills the vacuum. Others asked a harder question: why do Africans see our help as control? It was a question without an easy answer. For generations, Africa's partnerships had been written in someone else's language, sealed with someone else's interests. But Ibrahim Traoré was writing a different kind of contract, one signed with blood, dignity, and defiance. Even in American communities with African roots, especially among the diaspora, his name began to circulate. Social media posts read, "He's not anti-West, he's pro-Africa." Because in the end, the world's greatest discomfort wasn't about a military mobilization. It was about what that mobilization meant: that Africa might no longer ask for permission to exist on its own terms. And from Washington to Paris, that realization echoed louder than any bullet ever could. The storm did not come with bombs or missiles. It came with meaning. A single death, once dismissed as suicide, had rewritten the moral map of a continent. And from the dust of Ouagadougou rose a truth too powerful to be ignored: Africa is no longer waiting for permission to defend its dignity. But revolutions, even the silent ones, carry danger. Already whispers of sanctions and regional intervention drift through the corridors of power in Paris, Washington, and Abidjan. Words like stability, democracy, and human rights are once again being reshaped, not to protect Africa, but to restrain it. Because every time an African nation stands up, the world finds a new way to tell it to sit down. And yet something has changed forever. The people of Burkina Faso no longer tremble when they say no. They build, they plant, they organize. Their young learn to fix drones and purify water. Their farmers share tools instead of debts. Their soldiers guard not an empire, but a memory, the memory of a man named Alino Faso, whose courage refused to die quietly. Across Africa, that memory is spreading to Mali, Niger, Ghana, Congo, even the Caribbean diaspora. What once began as a tragedy has become a doctrine. Sovereignty is not a threat, it's a birthright. And in that belief lies both Africa's promise and its peril. Because the more this new generation demands freedom, the more those who built their wealth on African silence will fight to keep it that way. So here's the question that echoes tonight, not only through the Sahel, but across every capital watching from afar: will the world punish Africa for defending itself, or finally listen to what it has to say? Captain Ibrahim Traoré has drawn the red line, not against the West, but against submission itself. Whether you agree or not, his actions force us all to confront an uncomfortable truth: the age of managed independence is ending. The age of unapologetic sovereignty has begun. If you believe that Alino Faso's death should awaken not just Burkina Faso, but the conscience of the world, share this story. If you believe that truth matters more than headlines, subscribe and stand with those who refuse to be silenced. Because the revolution of dignity will not be televised. It will be lived by every African who chooses freedom over fear.